The roar of twin Allison engines cuts through the tropical dawn. 18 silver P-38 Lightnings skim 50 feet above the Pacific, so low their prop wash kicks up salt spray. Inside the cockpit of the lead aircraft, Major John Mitchell checks his watch. 9:33 a.m., April 18, 1943. 1 minute to target. 400 miles behind him lies Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 400 miles of open ocean crossed at wave-top level, every second a gamble that Japanese radar wouldn't catch the glint of sunlight on aluminum. Mitchell's navigation has to be perfect, not approximately perfect, not close enough, absolutely perfect. Because somewhere in the sky ahead, invisible against the blue horizon, flies the man who planned Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of December 7th, the most brilliant naval strategist Japan has ever produced. And today, he has no idea he's flying into an ambush orchestrated from 6,000 miles away by codebreakers who cracked his Navy's most secret cipher. The P-38s are pushing their absolute maximum range. Extra fuel tanks hang beneath their wings, already dropped into the sea behind them. There's no margin for error, no time for a second pass. 10 minutes of combat, that's all the fuel will allow before they have to turn for home. Miss this window and Yamamoto disappears back into the fortress of Rabaul, untouchable for the rest of the war. Mitchell's radio crackles. Bogies, 11 o'clock, high. There, 2 bombers escorted by Zeros, descending toward Bougainville, exactly where the intercept calculations predicted. Yamamoto's legendary punctuality, the very trait that makes him an exceptional commander, has delivered him into American crosshairs with Swiss watch precision. The killer flight breaks formation, climbing hard. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber angle toward the bombers. The P-38's 4 50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon are already armed. What happens in the next 8 minutes will change the course of the Pacific War. But before we witness the most daring aerial assassination in military history, you need to understand how American intelligence achieved the impossible. Reading Japan's unbreakable codes and turning the enemy's own words into a death sentence. If you're fascinated by the hidden battles of World War II, subscribe now. We're just getting started. 14 months earlier, December 7, 1941, the name Isoroku Yamamoto became synonymous with American fury. As commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, he had orchestrated the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, an operation so audacious, so perfectly executed, that it killed 2,403 Americans and crippled the Pacific Fleet in a single morning. But Yamamoto was no stereotypical warlord drunk on conquest. Born in 1884, he had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921, traveled extensively across America, and served twice as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than perhaps any Japanese leader. He had warned his superiors that war with the United States was unwinnable in a prolonged conflict. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory, Yamamoto had said. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success. His prophecy proved devastatingly accurate. Pearl Harbor gave Japan 6 months of dominance. Then came Midway in June 1942, a turning point battle where American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, halting Japan's Pacific expansion. By early 1943, the tide was turning, but slowly, bloodily. Guadalcanal had been taken after 6 months of brutal fighting. The Solomon Islands campaign ground forward island by island. And through it all, Yamamoto remained the symbol, not just of Japanese military power, but of the attack that had started the war. American newspapers called him the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. Military planners understood his strategic genius made him irreplaceable. Politically, his death would deliver psychological impact worth a dozen battlefield victories. But Yamamoto operated from Rabaul, a fortress base on New Britain Island, surrounded by hundreds of miles of Japanese-controlled territory. He was protected by the most fanatical fighter pilots in the world, flying the legendary Zero. Getting to him seemed impossible. Until April 14, 1943, when a routine radio intercept changed everything. 3 listening stations across the Pacific picked up the same encoded Japanese naval transmission. Message designation NTF 13175. The number of addressees alone flagged it as significant. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration at Pearl Harbor, Navy cryptanalysts went to work on the cipher. What they were about to discover would set in motion the longest fighter interception mission ever attempted. The message that arrived at Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking center in Hawaii, was encrypted in JN-25D, the Japanese naval cipher that had become both America's most valuable intelligence asset and its most jealously guarded secret. JN-25 consisted of approximately 33,000 code groups, combinations of 5-digit numbers, each representing words, phrases, or letters. The system used a 2-step encryption, first encoding the message using a codebook, then adding a second layer of cipher using numerical additives. Breaking it required not just mathematical genius, but understanding of Japanese naval terminology, communications patterns, and enough intercepted traffic to spot the patterns. Leading the code-breaking effort was Commodore John Rochefort, a naval intelligence officer who combined fluency in Japanese with obsessive dedication. His team included brilliant young cryptanalysts like Ensign John Paul Stevens, who would later become a Supreme Court justice. They worked in shifts around the clock, using IBM punch-card tabulating machines and hand calculations to strip away the cipher's layers. The Japanese had changed JN-25 on April 1st, updating their additive books. But American cryptanalysts had recovered large portions of the new system within 2 weeks, fast enough to read the April 14th intercept in near real time. As the decrypt emerged, Marine Major Alva Laswell rushed it to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer. Layton's eyes went wide as he read the plain text. The message detailed an inspection tour by Sink Combined Fleet, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Yamamoto himself. The itinerary was precise: departure time from Rabaul, flight path, arrival times at 3 forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The tour was scheduled for April 18th, 4 days away. Yamamoto would be flying in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by fighters. The flight would bring him to Balalai Airfield, New Bougainville, the closest he would come to American forces, and barely within range of the longest-range fighters stationed at Guadalcanal. Layton grabbed the decrypt and ran down the hall to Admiral Chester Nimitz's office. The Pacific Fleet commander read it once, then looked up. "Do we try to get him?" Nimitz asked. "Would the Japanese be able to replace him with someone better?" Layton, who had known Yamamoto personally during his time as naval attaché in Tokyo, didn't hesitate. "No, sir," Layton replied. "There is no one who could replace Yamamoto. He is uniquely irreplaceable. His prestige among the Japanese people and military is unmatched. His strategic ability, his experience, there's simply no other admiral of his stature." Nimitz made his decision immediately. The decrypt went up the chain of command at unprecedented speed. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox delivered it personally to President Franklin Roosevelt. The president's response, according to multiple sources, was direct: "Get Yamamoto." But the decision sparked immediate debate. Killing a specific enemy commander wasn't standard American policy. It invited retaliation in kind. What if the Japanese started targeting American admirals? Moreover, it risked the greatest intelligence secret of the war. If the intercept succeeded, wouldn't Japan realize their codes had been broken? British Prime Minister Winston Churchill reportedly protested to Roosevelt. Britain's intelligence chiefs argued that no single kill, however valuable, was worth compromising the code-breaking advantage that had already won Midway and was saving countless lives every day. The arguments were overruled. Yamamoto wasn't just any admiral. He was the man who had struck the blow that started the war. His death would be revenge, yes, but also a strategic masterstroke. Intelligence assessments concluded that Japan had no admiral of comparable ability waiting in the wings. As for protecting the code-breaking secret, a cover story was prepared. Coast watchers, Australian scouts hidden throughout the Solomon Islands, had observed Yamamoto boarding the bomber and radioed the information to American forces. It was plausible enough. The approval came back stamped with extraordinary language. Squadron 339 P-39 must at all costs reach and destroy. President attaches extreme importance to mission. Now came the impossible part, actually doing it. Yamamoto's flight path would take him from Rabaul to Balalai, approximately 315 miles in a straight line. But American fighters couldn't approach directly. They'd be spotted by Japanese radar installations and observation posts scattered throughout the Solomons. The only fighters with sufficient range were P-39 Lightnings based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Even they would be operating at absolute maximum range. And the mission would require navigation so precise that the intercepting fighters would have to arrive at exactly the right point in the sky at exactly the right moment, without the benefit of radar guidance or radio communication that might give away their approach. Major John Mitchell, commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, calculated the odds of success at 1,000 to 1. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike any other fighter in the sky. With its distinctive twin-boom design, tricycle landing gear, and counter-rotating propellers, it looked like something from a science fiction magazine. But for this mission, aesthetics didn't matter. What mattered was range. The P-38G model stationed at Henderson Field packed formidable firepower. 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose for devastating accuracy. Twin Allison V1710 engines gave it a top speed of nearly 400 miles per hour and the power to climb faster than any Japanese fighter at altitude. But the real key was fuel capacity. With 2 external drop tanks mounted under the wings, a P-38 could theoretically fly 1,000 miles round trip. Theoretically. In practice, combat maneuvering burned fuel at rates the engineers never planned for. And this mission would require both extreme range and the ability to fight. Major Mitchell assembled his planning team. The mathematics were brutal. Guadalcanal to the predicted intercept point, 435 miles. But flying a direct route was suicide. Japanese radar at Kahili on Bougainville's southern tip would spot them 100 miles out. So they'd have to take a roundabout path, swinging 200 miles west out over open ocean before turning north. Total distance, 600 miles out, 400 miles back, 1,000 miles. At wave-top level to avoid radar, with fuel consumption calculated to the gallon. Mitchell plotted 5 navigation legs using compass headings, time intervals, and airspeed alone. No radar, no radio navigation beacons, just dead reckoning over featureless ocean. A single degree of error in heading maintained over 400 miles would put them dozens of miles off target. The intercept window was exactly 10 minutes. Yamamoto's bomber would be in vulnerable airspace for only that long before descending under the protective umbrella of Bougainville's 75 Zero fighters. If the P-38s arrived early, they'd circle and burn fuel they couldn't afford to waste. If they arrived late, Yamamoto would be gone. Mitchell needed 18 pilots willing to bet their lives on his navigation. 18 men who understood they might run out of fuel and ditch in the Pacific hundreds of miles from rescue. 18 volunteers for what might be a one-way trip. He got them in less than an hour. Every pilot in the squadron wanted in.
The final selection came down to fuel efficiency. The best pilots at managing engine settings, the ones who could squeeze every mile from a drop tank.
April 17, 1943. The afternoon briefing at Henderson Field was unlike anything the pilots had ever experienced. Senior officers from Navy and Marine commands crowded into the operations dugout, a level of brass never seen for a routine patrol. Mitchell stood before a map of the Solomon Islands. He didn't mention Yamamoto by name. The official briefing said only that they would intercept a high-ranking officer. But the pilots weren't stupid. The amount of planning, the presidential priority stamp, the absolute secrecy, this was something extraordinary. The mission profile was explained in clinical detail. 4 P-38s would form the killer flight, tasked with attacking the bombers directly. Captain Thomas Lanphier, Jr. would lead them, with Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Jim McClanahan, and Lieutenant Joe Moore. 14 more P-38s would fly top cover, engaging any Zero escorts to give the killer flight clear shots. They would take off at 7:10 a.m. on April 18th, Palm Sunday, though there were no religious holidays observed on Guadalcanal. The flight would proceed at 50 feet above the ocean for over 2 hours. Radio silence absolute. Navigation by Mitchell's dead reckoning alone. "If we're off by even a few minutes," Mitchell explained, "we'll never see them. If we're late, they'll be on the ground under fighter protection. If we're early, we'll run out of fuel circling." He paused, letting that sink in. The intercept is calculated for 9:35 a.m., plus or minus 1 minute. We'll be flying 435 miles on a precise heading with no electronic aids. The enemy is legendary for punctuality. Our navigation has to be more precise than theirs. The pilots studied the map. Bougainville was deep in Japanese territory. If shot down, they'd either drown in the Pacific or face capture in hostile jungle. The closest American rescue assets were over 300 miles away. Lieutenant Doug Canning asked the question everyone was thinking. What if we encounter more than 2 bombers? "Intelligence says 2 Bettys," Mitchell replied. 6 Zero escorts. You shoot down every aircraft in the formation. No survivors means no radio warning to rob all. They understood. This wasn't just about killing one man. It was about making sure Japan never knew how he died, at least not in a way that would compromise the code-breaking operation that had made it possible. The P-38s were prepped throughout the night. Ground crews checked every rivet, every fuel line, every electrical connection. The external drop tanks were crucial, 310-gallon capacity beneath each wing. Without them, the mission was impossible. With them, the P-38s were flying gas cans, vulnerable to the slightest spark. Armorers loaded the 50-caliber ammunition belts and the 20-millimeter cannon drums. The nose-mounted armament gave the P-38 a unique advantage. All guns fired forward in a tight cone, making deflection shooting easier than wing-mounted guns that required convergence calculation. A burst from a P-38 could saw through a Betty's fuselage like a chainsaw. In the Cryptanalysis Center at Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers continued monitoring Japanese naval traffic. Any change, any deviation from Yamamoto's schedule would trigger an abort signal to Guadalcanal. But the intercepts remained consistent. Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. Tokyo time aboard a Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zeros, with a second Betty carrying his staff following close behind. His ETA at Balalai, 8 a.m. Tokyo time, 9:35 a.m. Guadalcanal time, accounting for the time zone difference. The Japanese message even specified that the inspection tour was meant to boost morale after the Guadalcanal defeat. Yamamoto would greet the troops, inspect the air units, deliver a speech. He was scheduled to spend 45 minutes on the ground before flying to the next base. The Americans had no intention of letting him land. At 6 a.m. on April 18th, the P-38 pilots assembled for a final weather briefing. Clear skies expected, light winds, visibility unlimited,
Good for navigation, bad for concealment. They would be visible for miles once airborne. The pilots suited up, checking their survival gear: canteen, sidearm, emergency rations, shark repellent. The last item drew grim jokes. Plenty of sharks in these waters, and the P-38's cockpit wasn't designed for water landings. If the plane went down, the pilot had seconds to get out before it sank. At 7:10 a.m., Mitchell's P-38 rolled down Henderson Field's pierced steel planking runway. One by one, the other Lightnings followed, their twin engines roaring in perfect synchronization. 2 spare aircraft went along. Mechanical failure was always possible, and losing even one plane from the strike force could compromise the mission. At 6 a.m. on April 18th, the P-38 pilots assembled for a final weather briefing. Clear skies expected. Light winds. Visibility unlimited. Good for navigation, bad for concealment. They would be visible for miles once airborne. The pilots suited up, checking their survival gear: canteen, sidearm, emergency rations, shark repellent. The last item drew grim jokes. Plenty of sharks in these waters, and the P-38's cockpit wasn't designed for water landings. If the plane went down, the pilot had seconds to get out before it sank. At 7:10 a.m., Mitchell's P-38 rolled down Henderson Field's pierced steel planking runway. One by one, the other Lightnings followed, their twin engines roaring in perfect synchronization. 2 spare aircraft went along. Mechanical failure was always possible, and losing even one plane from the strike force could compromise the mission. The formation assembled over Guadalcanal, then turned northwest. Mitchell checked his watch, his compass, his airspeed. The first navigation leg was 265 miles on heading 290 degrees. He throttled back to cruise settings, conserving fuel. The drop tanks would feed first, keeping the internal fuel reserves at maximum. Behind him, the other 17 P-38s descended to wave-top level, 50 feet. Some pilots counted sharks in the clear water below. Others counted pieces of driftwood, anything to stay alert during the monotonous hours of ocean transit. The heat was intense. The P-38's cockpit couldn't be ventilated during flight. Opening a window would cause dangerous buffeting. Pilots stripped to T-shirts, sweat soaking through their flight suits. Some reported dozing off momentarily, only to be jolted awake by turbulence or Mitchell's slight course corrections. No one spoke. Radio silence was absolute. Japanese listening posts throughout the Solomons monitored Allied radio frequencies constantly. One transmission, even a brief test of equipment, could alert them to incoming aircraft. Mitchell navigated by pure dead reckoning: compass heading, airspeed, time. He'd calculated each leg to the second, accounting for wind drift based on the morning weather briefing. There were no landmarks over open ocean, no way to verify position. He was betting 18 lives and the war's most important intercept on his mathematics being correct. At 8:10 a.m., the formation reached the first waypoint, an arbitrary point in the middle of the Pacific that existed only in Mitchell's calculations. He banked to heading 020 degrees. The next leg was 155 miles, calculated to bring them to a point 10 miles west of Bougainville. Fuel gauges showed the external tanks draining steadily. Some pilots noticed their fuel consumption running higher than expected. The strain of formation flying at low altitude was burning fuel faster than the engineers had calculated. They kept quiet, hoping Mitchell's math included a safety margin. At 9:25 a.m., land appeared on the horizon, Bougainville. Mitchell checked his watch. 10 minutes early. Perfect. He throttled back slightly, adjusting airspeed to arrive at the intercept point at precisely 9:35. The killer flight moved into attack formation. Drop tanks were jettisoned, splashing into the ocean. The P-38's climb rate improved immediately. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, breaking 2 hours of silence. Skin your eyes. At 9:34 a.m., Lieutenant Doug Canning's voice came over the radio. Bogies, 11 o'clock, high. Every pilot's head snapped left. There, exactly where Mitchell's calculations predicted, 2 bombers and 6 Zeros were descending toward Bougainville. The Betty bombers were still at 5,000 feet, beginning their approach to Balalai airfield. The Zero escorts flew in a loose formation around them. Yamamoto's legendary punctuality had delivered him into the ambush with precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. He was exactly on time, exactly where the decoded message said he would be. And he had no idea that 18 American fighters were climbing toward him from below. The killer flight, Lanphier, Barber, McClanahan, and more broke formation and angled for altitude. The 14 cover aircraft climbed to 18,000 feet to engage the Zeros. Mitchell held his position, maintaining a command view of the developing battle. But something was wrong. Intelligence had said 1 bomber. There were 2. The pilots had no way of knowing which Betty carried Yamamoto and which carried his staff. They would have to destroy both. Barber focused on the lead bomber, its landing gear already beginning to extend. Lanphier went for the second. The Zero escorts suddenly spotted the P-38s climbing toward them and broke formation, diving to intercept. 3 Zeros from Kahili airfield, alerted by the Betty pilots' radio calls, came screaming in from the north. The mission was seconds from disintegrating into a wild dogfight. Barber closed on the lead Betty. The bomber's pilots saw him coming and pushed the throttles forward, abandoning the landing approach and diving for the jungle canopy. The rear gunner opened fire with the 20mm tail cannon, tracers arcing toward Barber's P-38. Barber ignored the defensive fire. At 200 yards, he pressed the trigger. 4 50-caliber machine guns and the 20mm cannon erupted. The concentrated fire stream caught the Betty's right engine. Fuel sprayed, ignited, and the engine exploded in a fireball. The Betty's right wing folded upward from the explosion. The bomber rolled inverted and plunged into the jungle below, exploding on impact. Inside that burning wreckage was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. But Barber didn't know that yet. He was already engaging a Zero that had latched onto his tail.
Lanphier had problems of his own. The second Betty had also abandoned its landing approach and was making a desperate run for the coast. The pilot was good, using the bomber's maneuverability at low altitude to make a difficult target. Zero escorts swarmed around Lanphier's P-38, their 20mm cannon rounds sparking off his wings. Lieutenant Besby Holmes broke through a gap in the Zero screen and got a clear shot at the second Betty. His gunfire raked the bomber from nose to tail. The Betty's pilot fought for control, but the damage was catastrophic. The bomber crashed into the sea at full speed, exploding on impact. The furious air battle lasted exactly 8 minutes. The cover flight engaged the Japanese fighters in a swirling dogfight over Bougainville. Zeros had superior maneuverability at low altitude, but the P-38s had speed and firepower. The Americans used dive and zoom tactics, refusing to turn with the nimble Japanese fighters. Lieutenant Raymond Hine wasn't as fortunate. A Zero, piloted by Kenji Yanagiya, caught Hine's P-38 in a vulnerable position. Cannon fire tore through the Lightning's port engine and cockpit. Hine's plane rolled inverted and fell toward the ocean. He never got out. The P-38 hit the water and disappeared. Mitchell watched the dogfight develop and made the hardest call of his career. Break off, return to base. The P-38s disengaged and dove for the deck. They'd completed their mission, both bombers destroyed, all occupants presumed dead. But fuel was critical. The 10 minutes of combat had burned through their reserves faster than expected. The 400-mile return flight would be on fumes. Holmes was so low on fuel that he couldn't make it back to Guadalcanal. He diverted to the Russell Islands, landing with his engines coughing on empty tanks. The other P-38s made it back to Henderson Field, several with fuel gauges reading 0 as they touched down.
As Mitchell's lightning rolled to a stop, Lanfear's voice crackled over the radio, breaking operational security with a transmission that would become legendary. "That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House." It was a misquote. Yamamoto had never actually said he would dictate terms in the White House. But the message was clear. The mission was accomplished. Whether they had actually killed Yamamoto wouldn't be confirmed until the next day.
On Bougainville, Japanese ground forces scrambled toward the crash sites. The bomber that had gone down in the jungle was still burning. The one that hit the water had broken apart on impact, scattering debris across the ocean's surface. The jungle crash site wasn't reached until the following morning, April 19th. What the recovery team found would send shockwaves through Japan's military command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in the wreckage, still strapped into his seat, still gripping his samurai sword. He had been thrown from the fuselage on impact, but remained upright, as if sitting at attention. His white gloves were immaculate despite the surrounding devastation. The autopsy revealed he had been killed before the crash. 2 .50-caliber bullets had struck him, one in the left shoulder blade, one through the left side of his jaw. Either wound would have been fatal. Yamamoto had died within seconds of Barber's guns opening fire, never knowing he'd been ambushed. The recovery from the water crash yielded 3 survivors, including Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff. Ugaki would later describe the attack. American fighters appearing from nowhere, perfectly positioned, perfectly timed. It was as if they had known the exact flight path and schedule. In Rabaul, Japanese naval officers initially refused to believe Yamamoto was dead. The greatest admiral in Japanese history, killed by chance encounter over Bougainville? Impossible. But as more details emerged, the truth became unavoidable. The Japanese military kept Yamamoto's death secret for over a month. They couldn't announce it immediately. Operational security demanded that ongoing campaigns continue without revealing the leadership vacuum. But more than that, they needed time to process the psychological impact. On May 21, 1943, Japan finally announced Admiral Yamamoto's death in combat while directing operations from an airplane. No mention was made of American fighters, no details given about the circumstances. The news was carefully managed to minimize the blow to national morale. But the Japanese High Command understood something was wrong. The timing was too precise. The American fighters too perfectly positioned. Some officers suspected the codes had been compromised. But which code? Japan used dozens of cipher systems. They investigated, focusing on the wrong systems, and concluded the attack must have been luck or perhaps spotted by coast watchers. The JN-25 cipher remained in use, continuing to leak Japanese naval secrets to American codebreakers for the rest of the war. In Washington, the reaction was jubilation tempered by paranoia. The mission had succeeded beyond expectations, but now came the delicate problem of managing the information. If it became public that American fighters had specifically targeted and killed Yamamoto, Japan might deduce their codes were broken. The cover story was distributed to American forces. Coast watchers in the Solomons had spotted Yamamoto boarding the bomber and radioed the location to nearby patrol aircraft. The P-38s happened to be in the area and engaged opportunistically. But operational security was compromised almost immediately. Pilots talked. Officers shared details with friends. By June 1943, unauthorized accounts of the mission began circulating. In October 1943, Time magazine published an article about Operation Vengeance, the name given to the mission, and mentioned Captain Lanfear by name. The U.S. Navy was outraged. This was exactly the kind of security breach that could alert Japan to the code-breaking advantage. As punishment, Major Mitchell's nomination for the Medal of Honor was downgraded to the Navy Cross. All pilots on the mission received Navy Crosses, a prestigious award, but not the recognition Mitchell's navigation had earned.
The true story wasn't released to the American public until September 10, 1945, after Japan's surrender. By then, captured Japanese intelligence officers were being debriefed, and U.S. intelligence wanted to keep the code-breaking secret longer. Knowledge that JN-25 had been broken might drive Japanese officers, bound by honor codes, to suicide rather than admit they had failed to protect their communications security. Even after the war, controversy plagued the mission. Lanphier claimed credit for shooting down Yamamoto's bomber. Barber disputed this, backed by evidence and witness testimony. The argument continued until Lanphier's death in 1987, and even beyond. Barber contested the credit until his death in 2001. Modern analysis of gun camera footage, bullet trajectories, eyewitness accounts, and Japanese records points decisively to Rex Barber as the pilot who killed Yamamoto. Lanphier's angle of attack would have been impossible given the Betty's flight path and the timing of events. But as Lieutenant Julius Jacobson, another mission pilot, remarked in 1997, "There were 15 of us who survived, and as far as who did the effective shooting, who cares? There is glory for the whole team."
The impact of Yamamoto's death on Japan's war effort was profound and multifaceted. On a tactical level, the Japanese Navy lost its most brilliant strategist. Yamamoto's successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, was competent but lacked Yamamoto's innovative thinking and ability to inspire loyalty across the fleet. More devastating was the psychological blow. Yamamoto had been treated almost as a demigod within Japanese military circles. His death was seen as equivalent to losing a major battle. Morale among naval personnel plummeted. One American naval historian, Samuel Eliot Morrison, later described the reaction as the Japanese naval equivalent of the Marines losing Iwo Jima. The American public reaction was jubilant once the news was finally released. Yamamoto represented the attack that had started the war. His death felt like justice, revenge for Pearl Harbor. But military planners understood the deeper significance. Japan had lost irreplaceable institutional knowledge. Yamamoto's understanding of American capabilities, his strategic vision, his ability to maximize Japan's limited resources, these couldn't be replicated. Some historians have debated whether killing Yamamoto was the right decision. He had opposed war with America, arguing it was unwinnable. Perhaps a Yamamoto-led Japan would have sought peace negotiations earlier? But this analysis ignores Japanese military culture in 1943. Yamamoto was a loyal officer who would fight to the end once war was declared. His personal doubts were irrelevant to his professional duty. The broader intelligence implications were even more significant. The mission demonstrated that ultra-intelligence, information derived from code-breaking, could be weaponized with surgical precision. The success validated the massive resources poured into cryptanalysis. It showed that breaking enemy codes wasn't just about gathering information, it could create offensive opportunities. For the P-38 pilots, the mission became legendary. It remained the longest fighter intercept in World War II history. Mitchell's navigation, dead reckoning over 400 miles of ocean to arrive within 1 minute of the target, stood as a masterpiece of aerial planning. But the mission's success rested on a foundation built by cryptanalysts working in basement offices thousands of miles away. The codebreakers who cracked JN-25, who decrypted message NTF-1375, who recognized the significance of Yamamoto's itinerary, they made the kill possible. In the months following Yamamoto's death, Japanese naval operations showed the absence of his strategic leadership. The defensive battles at Tarawa, the Philippine Sea, and Light Gulf were fought with increasing desperation and diminishing effectiveness. Japan never again won a major naval engagement in the Pacific. American submarines and aircraft, guided by continued decryption of JN-25 traffic, devastated Japanese shipping. By July 1943, the U.S. Army had also broken Japanese Army supply codes, resulting in catastrophic losses to merchant convoys. 2/3 of the Japanese merchant marine was destroyed before war's end, strangling Japan's ability to move troops and supplies.
The codebreakers continued their work in secret. Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, the Army's Arlington Hall facility in Virginia, and British operations at Bletchley Park processed thousands of intercepted messages monthly. By late 1943, Allied intelligence was reading current Japanese naval traffic almost in real time. The operational security around Operation Vengeance eventually held, despite the early leaks. Japan never confirmed that JN-25 had been compromised. Post-war interrogations of Japanese intelligence officers revealed they suspected American code-breaking capabilities but never understood the extent. Many went to their graves believing the cipher systems were unbreakable. For the P-38 pilots who flew the mission, life went on. Some became aces. Others were killed in subsequent combat. Rex Barber survived the war and built a successful civilian career, never seeking glory for the Yamamoto kill, despite evidence supporting his claim. Thomas Lanphier also survived, parlayed his wartime fame into business success, but his continued insistence on sole credit for the kill created lasting controversy. Major John Mitchell, whose navigation made the entire mission possible, received less recognition than he deserved. His Navy Cross citation mentioned only extraordinary achievement in combat, with no reference to the specifics. He remained modest about his role, deflecting credit to the team. Lieutenant Raymond Hine, the only American killed in the mission, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. His body was never recovered from the waters off Bougainville. The wreckage of Yamamoto's Betty bomber remained in the jungle near Buin, Bougainville, for decades. Parts were eventually recovered and sent to the Isoroku Yamamoto Family Museum in Nagaoka, Japan. The crash site became a minor tourist attraction, visited by both American veterans and Japanese citizens seeking to honor the Admiral's memory.
Today, Operation Vengeance stands as one of the most precisely executed military operations in history. It demonstrated the convergence of intelligence, technology, navigation, and air power into a single decisive strike. Every element had to work perfectly. The code breakers had to intercept and decrypt the message. Intelligence officers had to recognize its significance. Commanders had to authorize the risky mission. Mitchell had to navigate flawlessly. The P-38s had to have sufficient range. The pilots had to execute under combat conditions, and Yamamoto had to be exactly on time. The mission's success changed modern warfare. It proved that intelligence could create offensive opportunities that traditional reconnaissance could never achieve. The concept of actionable intelligence, information precise enough to base immediate military operations on, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. The ethical questions the mission raised remain relevant. Was targeting a specific individual assassination or legitimate military action? Did the risk of compromising code-breaking capabilities justify the operation? Modern targeted killing operations, from Vietnam to the War on Terror, echo the same debates that occurred in April 1943. For Japan, Yamamoto's death marked the end of an era. The Admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had warned that war with America was unwinnable, who had fought brilliantly despite his doubts, he was gone. What remained was a military machine increasingly desperate, fighting battles it could not win, against an enemy whose industrial capacity and code-breaking abilities made Japanese defeat inevitable. The P-38 Lightning that shot down Yamamoto never became as famous as the Spitfire or the Mustang. But in the hands of skilled pilots, executing one perfect mission, it changed the course of the Pacific War. In the basement offices where cryptoanalysts worked through the night, cracking codes that seemed unbreakable, building the intelligence foundation that would win the war, those unsung heroes made operations like Vengeance possible. Their work remained classified for decades, their names unknown, their contributions unrecognized until long after the war ended. But on April 18, 1943, they proved that sometimes the pen, or in this case the cipher machine, truly is mightier than the sword.
If this hidden history fascinates you, subscribe and comment with other stories you'd like to see uncovered. The secret battles of World War II contain countless untold operations that changed the world. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical or documented sources.